From today's psalm, teach me your way, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. I've never lived on a farm. For that matter, I've never been much of a fisherman either. The combination of the group that heard Jesus speak about the weeds and the tares today in another of the teaching gospels, Jesus ends up doing some homeschooling today after telling about the weeds and the enemy that has planted those weeds, and how the owner of the property has decided, let the weeds and the wheat grow together simultaneously, and only at the harvest will they be sorted out. Grandma Mittermaier had the best garden that I had ever seen until I got here. The best garden was a necessity for them. It was a pastor who beginning in like 1921 in his ministry was never paid more than a pittance, and for whom chickens and a half a pig at Christmas was also a part of compensation. But Grandma Mittermeier's garden stemmed from her growth in Brookville, Indiana, and raised there on a farm, and the family continues to farm down in that area. As far as fishing, that pole of mine has a lot of dust on it. Never had much luck, maybe didn't have enough patience. So I can't profess to be an expert on either gardening, although I've raised my fair share of tomatoes in my life. And heaven knows if you drive by our property, you know that there's a lot of gardening that needs to be done and a lot of weeding that is essential there. But the weeds and the tares produces some confusion for us. It sounds like it should be so obvious. The neat people want to get those weeds out right away, want to deal with those weeds. Let the good stuff have the moisture, particularly in a drought like we're in right now, or in the heat conditions as well. But let's start with a little humor today, in fact, in our uptight and anxious and sometimes frustrated world. I'm indebted to my colleague Charlie Woodward over at Epiphany for this particular story that takes place supposedly between God and St. Francis. And though we don't have many farmers in this congregation, we've got a few that live on farms. And then we've got our chief farmer out in the garden, Ron. So he's the unseen voice today of St. Francis. So here's how this goes. Francis, you know all about gardens and nature. What in the world is going on down there? What happened to the dandelions, violets, thistle, and stuff I started eons ago? I had a perfect no-maintenance garden plan. Those plants grow in any type of soil, withstand drought, and multiply with abandon. The nectar from the long-lasting blossoms attracts butterflies, honeybees, and flocks of songbirds. I expected to see a vast garden of colors by now, but all I see are these green rectangles.
It's the tribes that settled there, Lord, the suburbanites. They started calling your flowers weeds and went to great lengths to kill them and replace them with grass.
Grass? But it's so boring. It's not colorful. It doesn't attract butterflies, birds, and bees. Only grubs and sodworms. It's temperamental with temperatures. Do these suburbanites really want all that grass growing there?
Apparently so, Lord. They go to great pains to grow it and keep it green. They begin each spring by fertilizing grass and poisoning any other plant that crops up in the lawn.
The spring rains and warm weather probably make grass grow really fast. That must make the suburbanites happy.
Apparently not, Lord. As soon as it grows a little bit, they cut it sometimes twice a week.
They cut it? Do they then bale it like hay?
Not exactly, Lord. Most of them rake it up and put it into bags.
They bag it? Why? Is it a cash crop? Do they sell it?
No, sir, just the opposite. They pay to throw it away.
Now, let me get this straight. They fertilize grass so that it will grow, and when it does grow, they cut it off and pay to throw it away.
Yes, sir.
These suburbanites must be relieved in the summer when we cut back on the rain and turn up the heat. That surely slows the growth and saves them a lot of work.
You're not going to believe this, Lord. When the grass stops growing so fast, they drag out their hoses and pay more money to water it so they can continue to mow it and pay to get rid of it. What
nonsense. Well, at least they kept some of the trees. That was a sheer stroke of genius, if I do say so myself. The trees grow leaves in the spring to provide beauty and shade in the summer. In the autumn, they fall to the ground and form a natural blanket to keep moisture in the soil and protect the trees and the bushes. Plus, as they rot, the leaves form compost to enhance the soil. It's a natural circle of life.
You better sit down, Lord. The suburbanites have drawn a new circle. As soon as the leaves fall, they rake them into great piles, and they pay to have them hauled away.
No. What do they do to protect the shrub and tree roots in the winter and to keep the soil moist and loose?
After throwing away the leaves, they go out and buy something which they call mulch. They haul it home and spread it around in place of the leaves.
And where do they get this mulch?
They cut down trees and grind them up to make the mulch.
Enough. I don't want to think about this anymore. St. Catherine has planned a movie for us tonight. She's in charge of the arts, you know. What movie has she scheduled for us tonight?
Dumb and Dumber, Lord. It's a really stupid movie about...
Never mind. I think I just heard you share the whole story. So a bit of humor for us, and maybe a little bit about the kind of confusion that shows up in that gospel reading, the weeds and the tares. Somehow or other, the servants of the landowner recognize the weeds right away. And they run to the master and they say, do you want us to go out there and with the hose and our tools to remove the weeds from the wheat? But oddly, the master says no. Let them grow together. That does seem like an unusual response. The weed in question in ancient Israel was called darnel. And it was very similar in appearance to the wheat, and in fact the roots would intertwine with the wheat. And so, as the master suggests, pulling up the one also risks rooting up the other as well. So the master says, no, let them grow together. Well, we've always been trying to figure out where's our spot in this particular parable. We, of course, want to be the good seed. We want to be that which has been planted by God himself. We certainly don't want to be that enemy that's pictured there, the one that has sowed the weeds in the wheat. But it's also tended to make us jump a little fast like the servants wanted to do. Let's determine for ourselves who's the weed and who's the wheat. We'll make that decision. This parable is a parable of caution about that. Maybe it's a good idea to take a little longer view and to think a little bit about maybe someone in your life who you thought was trouble, who you thought was a problem child, who you didn't have much in the way of expectations for, and who turned out to be quite a surprise, quite a wonderful surprise. We as pastors did that this week and talked via Zoom. So around the Zoom table, if you will, about surprises in ministry. The toughest confirmation student who was the most sad to see a pastor leave his congregation and accept a new call. Or the one who didn't really want to worship as a child and gave parents grief and ends up becoming a pastor. Or circumstances like that. God takes the long view, and thankfully God takes the long view with us. God takes the long view in giving us and this world plenty of time. Jesus told these parables in an age 2,000 years before our own, but where the circumstances sound so similar. We despair of evil in our world. We despair about the COVID virus. We despair about seemingly God's inactivity. A visit with a homebound member this past week produced an interesting conversation because she said, I wish God could do something about this, but he can't. And I had to argue God's case in that instance. God is at work. God is at work among the scientists and the medical professionals and the frontline workers. God is at work. And we recall the scriptures telling us and reminding us often God's desire is not sin and sickness and death, but God's desire is life and life abundant. So we're encouraged here to take the long view as well, that God takes. We've got a shorter span to work with, but God has the long view, the eternal view. Jesus tells about the weeds and the wheat. And the disciples are confused. The disciples, primarily fishermen, we don't know of any that were actually farmers. So they asked for some home instruction. And in the house, it says Jesus taught them about that. And he gives some indications, but also that word of caution and that urge to take the long view. To see what God still has in mind for us at any age, no matter our age. For this world, no matter how bad we think it is now, it can't be worse than it was in 1918 by every account that I've heard. It can't be worse than during the Civil War. It can't be worse than the bubonic plagues and the Black Death and everything else that has befallen our sin-filled world. But we live only in our own time and sometimes only in our own bubble. And think and believe and call upon God to say, why don't you do something? Or why don't you end it all now? There was a response issued to a commentary about this gospel, and this comes from the farming community. So let's put ourselves as best we can in the shoes or the boots of a farmer. And this pastor wrote in, the big news in our farming community is that a judge stopped the use of dicamba, a weed killer. The reason the judge halted its use was because of dicamba drift. The weed killer drifted onto fields and gardens and killed good crops and good produce. I thought the farmers would be a bit more upset, but the ones I talked to last Sunday understood its dangers. One had even lost a tree to dicamba drift. Others had fields that had been damaged by the dicamba. The community to which I preach will understand that we are not going to go after weeds, or we might kill that which the Lord wants to be growing. If we kill sinful weeds, we might also kill fruit of the Spirit trees, or branches connected to the vine, or even acres and acres of wheat for the harvest. Yes, the harvest is plentiful and the laborers are few, and God does call us into the harvest, the long view, the end of the process. But God also calls us and grants us first the gift of his own patience, his own unconditional love, his acceptance of us where we're at, and his guidance and direction to move us forward in a path that he would lead us in. So, the analogies, not from our own rural backgrounds, not from our own farming experience, but from the analogies of Jesus, a carpenter, interestingly, who shows love, unconditional love, endless patience, desire that all might be saved and that none might be lost. So we can go back to the psalm and conclude the way I began. Teach me your way, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. Amen.